Hello and welcome to the Vicars Watch Dibley,
the podcast where real priests talk about pop culture and what we've learned about faith, life and the church. We've watched Dibley, now we're watching everything else. I'm Kate.
I'm Ross.
And I'm Ruthie. And today we're going back to our roots in many ways, but giving it a spicy twist, because we have watched The Minister of Divine, which is a US pilot version of the Vicar of Dibley that we have been discovering. And so we talk about the differences between Vicar of Dibley and the Minister of Divine, what we liked, what we didn't like, and all things Dibley.
Happy hello to you all.
Hello!
And happy 50th episode.
Oh my goodness!
Wow!
I feel a bit of a fraud because this isn't my 50th. I've come up late, but you two have done 50 whole episodes.
Yeah, and a few extra thrown in there as bonus episodes as well. But we're calling this our 50th episode.
This is our 50th.
Yeah, this is the 50th official.
We are in our vicarages and you're listening in. We're ready and raring to do a blast from the past. We're going scene by scene through The Minister of Divine, the unaired US pilot adapted from The Vicar of Dibley.
Yeah.
But first, we're going into our notices. Our first notice really is just that it's the 50th episode. Yeah. You've been going for 2 years.
Yeah, it's our second birthday as a podcast.
How does that feel?
We're two. We're in the terrible two.
The terrible two.
This means we're toddling. We can throw tantrums about stuff more now if we like.
It feels like we're a bit in our stride, though. It feels like, oh my goodness, how have we been doing this for 2 years? It also means that I've been in my role for over 2 years, because we started this just a few months after I started my current role. So
that's true, isn't it?
I know. Oh, it's
what
weird.
A long way you've all come since the start of this podcast.
Yeah, so thank you everyone who's been listening to us, to our subscribers, to people who've shared the podcast with others, to everyone who supported us, especially in getting the support that meant we could get Dawn French onto an episode.
Yeah.
That was incredible. So thank you so much to everyone. It's been amazing, and long may this keep going.
Amen.
Yeah.
It's really bizarre, isn't it? But it's been such a good thing to do. We didn't think anyone would actually listen, but here we are. People did listen.
How have you found that your ministry or your lives have been affected by doing this podcast, Kate and Ruthie?
Well, I get stopped on the street all the time and go, oh my gosh, are you that vicar from that podcast?
They see your face and know your voice.
Know my voice. Yeah, it's weird, isn't it? Because it is a podcast. No, that doesn't happen. It has actually happened to me a few times where people have seen my name and have recognised it from the podcast.
Oh, wow.
Which is really weird and lovely. And you do feel a bit like a star then. You're like, oh my gosh, minor Christian celebrity over here. And then you very quickly eat humble pie because you are not. Yeah. But it's amazing what doors it's opened and the stuff that, people have been interested in and gone, oh, I've thought about that, and engaging with it. It's been really good.
Yeah, I think I always feel a bit awkward when someone acknowledges that they know about the podcast. It feels very separate from my parish ministry. But I know I have a bit of a name for myself in the diocese as that vicar who knows a lot about the Vicar of Dibley.
I need to tell my diocese that I do it, actually.
Yeah, that might be a good idea.
Yeah. Oops. I'll just tell the comms team.
Yeah,
I had fun putting it in my application for my new job. Under publications, I was like, I'll put in that I help with a podcast.
Yeah. I've put it in my ministry development review that we do it, and that we now have, I think it's about 600 subscribers on Spotify, which is very exciting, and that it's been really, really fed me, I feel, in my ministry. And I'm really looking forward to see how it develops.
I think one of the things I found really helpful about since joining the podcast, I've not been here a year, I don't think, but one of the things I found really helpful is that in and amidst all of the madness of this particular parish's ministry, it's a wonderful parish, but some of the things that we've had to face together have been a bit overwhelming sometimes, is being able to come on with you guys and talk about theology and pop culture, which brings me such joy. That's how my brain works. So thank you for bringing me something that has just sort of alleviated and lifted some of the weight off my shoulders.
It's a good outlet, isn't it, to kind of take us away from the storms of parish ministry. And talking about storms, we'll get there in a moment.
We'll get to storms in a moment, but first, it wouldn't be the 50th episode if we didn't do something that takes us back to the very early of season 1, going into the confessional.
Right, yes, I'm afraid I've got to take us to the confessional, troops. In our previous episode 49, we talked about death in paradise, and I tried to give an overview of the Anglican Communion. And in trying to simplify the description, I misspoke, and I said that the Anglican Communion is the Church of England in other countries, whereas what I really meant is that the Anglican Communion is the Anglican Church in other territories, of which the Church of England is one of them. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, it's not just the Church of England abroad. It's a different thing.
Yes, it's not just a Church of England abroad. I tried to simplify things and made a mess of it. And I'm very sorry. Please forgive me.
We forgive you. We are a community of grace.
Thank you. Anyway, moving on from that embarrassment, we're going to move on to another embarrassment, which is...
she's coming out with the blows
coming in
already.
Strong. I'm coming in so strong.
Today we are talking about the Minister of Divine. Now, Kate is going to tell us a little bit about it, but in short, it is the US trying to do an adaptation of the Vicar of Dibley. It's an unaired pilot. It was never made
which
into
says
a
a lot,
proper
doesn't it?
show.
Yes. So I received a message via Instagram from Damien. Shout out to Damien, who's one of our listeners. Hi, Damien. And he said that we needed to watch this. It's the American adaptation of A Vicar of Dibley that didn't get commissioned. And he called it A Bizarro World of Vicar of Dibley. So thank you, Damien, for bringing this to our attention. As it's our birthday episode, the past 2 years we've watched the arrival of the first episode of The Vicar of Dibley. So we thought to spice things up, we'd watch The Minister of Divine. The Minister of Divine, as we've said, it was a 2007 unaired pilot of the American adaptation of A Vicar of Dibley, starring Kirstie Alley as the Minister of Divine. And really interestingly, the description of the show doesn't quite match what we watched. It's described as a woman returns to her small hometown to serve as a church's minister. But I don't think that's
She's
really
not from there.
on her actually coming from there. So, it really is Bizarro World Vicar of Dibley.
Well,
there's some similarities and some things very different.
So let's get into it. Ruthie, what were your initial reactions to Minister of Divine?
I think, well, Ross, in the words of Alice, I am going to slightly defend it a bit more than I think you two are.
Oh, interesting. You
Well, because...
You're assuming. You're making huge assumptions.
I am making an assumption. I think it tried to do too much in one episode. Because as we go through it, scene by scene, you'll if you are a nerd like us and recognise it, there's lots of Vicar of Dibley episodes all squashed into one. So there isn't the space to breathe, and you don't get to know Sydney, who is Geraldine in this. She's called Sydney in this version. Because you're just thrown lots of information very quickly, and you do lots of things all at once, and it doesn't quite work in the same way. But there were bits that I did think, actually, this does work, and they've adapted that bit really well, and I think it had potential. It did have potential. There were bits it needed changing, but it had potential.
Thank you, Ruthie. So that is a sort of a hopeful defence of it. Kate, what's your initial reactions?
I agree that too much was crammed into it. I think there were some things which just missed the mark slightly. I think it didn't have the... There's an affection in the Vicar of Dibley, the UK version of Vicar of Dibley, where at its core there is a goodness underlying everything, and there's an optimism, and we've talked about how it's deliberately filmed in a slightly blurry lens, so that everything seems lovely and pastoral, whereas here everything felt a little bit more... I don't know, I'm going to use the word brash, and I'd use that word for differences between Sydney and Geraldine. We'll get into that in a bit as well.
We will,
and it just felt like there was just less of a heart about it. It's, when our friend Dawn talked about her issues with Geraldine, she said how she found it really hard to work out how to play a character who's just good, but then she brought the humour to that character, and it's not that I don't think there wasn't that goodness, and there was some really interesting emotional beats in the episode, but maybe because it's not Geraldine and Dibley, it just didn't feel quite the same. And
it's
I
just
also
wrong.
wonder as well, I also wonder as well, like we as UK citizens are less familiar with the Episcopal Church in the US, and less familiar with how the parish works in that context. So we have less, perhaps, of the background or context for understanding maybe some of the references. So I wasn't sure whether things were translated across well.
Is she definitely an Episcopal minister?
I don't think it's confirmed what denomination she's a part of.
They talk about something in the episode, don't they, about who they're going to send the letter to.
Yeah.
But it didn't clock for me as to whether that indicated a particular denomination.
Yeah, so US listeners, can you let us know, does this fit with a particular denomination? Does it fit with what you're familiar with? It just felt very strange from my perspective. But then also there's weird similarities, like the sets. I first watched it. I thought they were using the same sets. I know they're not, but it felt like they were.
That threw me.
And that felt almost out of place for, again, the US context. I mean, I have been to some Episcopalian churches in the US, and they do, they are what we would recognise in the UK as a church.
But I was certainly taken aback by when they had the parish council scene, and the way that the tables were set out was identical.
Exactly the same.
So I found that fascinating. I mean, my own initial reaction, I didn't mind it. I was all right with it. I agree that absolutely they tried to cram too much in at once. I think what they tried to do by that was to try and serve some of the character and story.
Yeah.
The way that there's a sort of a relationship between the window smashing, but also with the relationship that the David Horton character equivalent has with the church, and actually how Sydney fits into that was really interesting.
I liked that addition.
But it also feels like she arrives and they're immediately unhappy with her, but she's also immediately doing stuff with ministry and outreach, and I think in the Vicar of Dibley you get a bit of a slow burn over the whole series, whilst I think in this pilot they've tried to capture.
They've tried to capture what the whole series might be like, and I do wonder if this had actually been commissioned, whether some of the plot lines which they'd crammed in would have been eked out a little bit to be spread out over a season. But they set up some really interesting possible storylines.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And I think what was really interesting is even right from the very start with the opening credits, we know we're not in Dibley because it's a different music. It's not the lovely choral Lord is My Shepherd that we're expecting. It's a sort of upbeat country guitar sort of thing. And I think maybe what I would have liked to have seen was a bit more of that specific setting to where they were. It felt like they had less of the, we definitely in the US and this is different to a UK parish. I don't know. I would have liked to see more cultural
Actually, I
influences,
suppose
maybe.
we'll get into the scene by scene in a moment. But one thing that actually season 1, certainly a Vicar of Dibley had, is that in between each scene, you would get a little vignette of something going on around the village. So you always felt very grounded and located within Dibley.
And that's what it
that
missed.
was something that you don't get.
Yeah, this felt like it could be anywhere in the US. I didn't get a sense of, oh, this is in Pennsylvania, or this is in Minnesota, or, you know, sorry, random states.
Yeah,
sure.
But it would have been nice to actually see them. And some of the US shows I really like are where there is that really clear sense of place. Or like if we go back to when we watched the Hallmark episodes, there's that really clear sense of small town America.
You loved it, really, didn't you? You loved the small town America Hallmark episodes.
Or like once upon a time.
Yeah.
Like that where they create a small town. And there's that really good sense of setting. I feel like that's something that this is missing, maybe.
And if you look at other, you know, the big US sitcoms that have done really well, things like, well, Schitt's Creek is Canadian, not US American, but and Parks and Rec springs to mind as well.
With Pawnee, they created a really nice setting.
Yeah, so like The Office, which was adapted from a British series, just in its opening credits shows the town it's in. So although you spend all your time in the office itself, actually you establish the kind of place it's at, which I don't think this had worked out, because it kind of talked about being a small town, but then there were lots of references to Hooters, and I don't know if Hooters, the place, is often found in rural small towns.
Yeah, it's like I would have liked to have seen maybe a little diner.
Yeah, that kind of thing.
Or this is us showing our ignorance of living in small town America. But I think one of the things that's really nice about Dibley is you have a really strong sense of setting. You know where you are. You're in this small rural English village, and they give you the characters and they show you their settings, and you get those little vignettes in between scenes of there's a sheep trapped in the telephone box, or like, anyway, those are our initial reactions to A Minister of Divine. I came into this strong, calling it an embarrassment. That was a bit of a joke. But we're going to go by scene.
Scene by scene. Let's get into it.
We don't have a script, so we're relying on my notes.
Yes.
Thank you for your notes,
My
Kate.
book is not there.
Our opening scene, like in the Vicar of Dibley, opens in the church, church with a mid-service with their aging vicar, the Revd Hornsby.
Yeah, and he's doing intercessions, and he gets them mixed up.
Yeah, that was a good adaptation. I thought that actually,
that was good,
it talked about the was it the local show or something like that? And because obviously couldn't use the joke about the Queen, so yeah, that worked mostly.
Yeah, and mixing up someone winning a prize with their rhubarb pie, and someone who'd given birth to a child.
Yeah,
and that was actually, I quite liked that. And then I also quite liked that he goes and that's when he passes away.
Yeah, that was good.
Reverend Pottle, doesn't he say amen and then
he goes
stop?
And then, it cuts to him and his head is in his hand and he's dead and he slumps. But in this one, the Alice equivalent, Sally, checks his pulse, and like Alice, announces the next hymn, which is, of course, "The day thou gavest, Lord, is ended." Wonderfully ironic.
And then the bloke just keels over.
Yeah.
The person who plays Sally was the only actor I recognised from this initially.
Oh, really?
And then later on, I was like, oh, wait, I know you as well. When she appeared, I was like, oh, it's her. I can't actually remember her name now off the top of my head, but I recognised her vaguely from Big Bang Theory. Because she
is Ricky Lindholm.
That's it.
Yeah, Ricky Lindholm. I also recognised the lady who plays Dorothy. Helen Slayton Hughes. She's in Parks and Rec.
I also recognise her from The West Wing.
Oh, yeah. So anyway, that's that. We see the opening service. We see some of our key characters as well in attendance. And then we cut to the parish council. And we're introduced to Divine's version of the Dibley characters. Let's just talk through them.
Yes.
And what the equivalents are and what we think about them. So our first is Mrs. Dorothy Vanderbosch, who is
Mrs. Cropley.
Mrs. Cropley. Yeah, our dear Letitia. I think actually this is quite a good equivalent.
Yeah.
I quite liked it.
Yeah, it works.
She nicks Frank's line, doesn't she, about the are we all here?
The hearing.
Yeah. Yes, perfectly.
Yeah.
So, but she was good. I liked her.
Then we have the next named character, I think, is JD. And he's the equivalent of Jim. And I think he's the most changed character, really.
No, didn't like JD.
I quite liked
because
him.
Because you just had him doing the no, yes, but you didn't have the kind of extra, like it felt like that was the only thing he did, and so you didn't have the kind of charm, in inverted commas, that Jim has in order to go, oh, okay, this is a lovely weird quirk. This was like, it felt me, I felt more sorry for him as opposed to finding it funny, like, oh, what's wrong with this chap?
I felt that the actor was doing their best, to take a gag that works in the UK rurally. In the UK, you can imagine being down your pub and there's Jim at the end of the bar. And, no, yes, and grounded somehow in British parlance, I suppose. And actually, it's difficult to translate that to I think overseas. I think it's a very cultural thing. But also when you put it into someone younger as well. And unless they're really able to make that a tick that works, it kind of either falls flat or just looks a bit offensive.
Whereas I think the verbal tick worked, but they didn't do enough in character development to make him distinct from the Owen equivalent character. So I felt that there was something there in them making the choice of him being younger, and it felt like it was meant to be some sort of ruralism and reference to a stereotype from the US. I don't know what that stereotype is because I wasn't given the context for where this is meant to be set. So it felt like they could have, and maybe again in a fuller series they'd actually be able to present some of that. Whereas with Jim's character, you don't really need to know where he's come from. You just know that he's an eccentric old man.
That's enough.
With this weird verbal tick.
The JD character, he felt a bit like Cletus for me from The Simpsons.
Oh, The Simpsons.
But not rounded enough.
I think with these characters, in the US adaptation, they needed to be much more distinct, bigger, stereotypical characters, I think. They all kind of blurred into one. And I think with Owen and Jim, and even to some extent maybe Frank, in the UK, Vicar of Dibley, they may look similar in that, scruffy old men, but actually they are very distinctly different characters. I would say Owen is a really dirty, randy old farmer, whilst Jim is
of dirty Randy.
Oh, golly.
I would say Frank is a very smart, well-to-do, put-together gentleman. So calling him a scruffy old
also
man
Randy.
is also Randy. Is rather offensive. Poor Frank.
But maybe I think perhaps in the UK, well, people say that in the UK we have a greater tradition of character actors, and I wonder if that's where the distinction comes through.
Yes, thank you, Caitlin.
There's more of the character.
Yeah.
I don't know. And also, I feel like Vicar of Dibley is very much an ensemble cast. And because this is just a pilot, we don't get the chance for an ensemble to form.
Yeah. Keep going with them, yeah.
Okay, so Hubert and Henry Wesley. These are the equivalents of Hugo and David Horton.
Yes.
Hubert is... he's okay. I'm sad he doesn't have the amazing tie.
Yeah.
You know?
He did have a nice jumper, but... Yeah.
He had a nice jumper, but maybe doesn't have quite the weirdness that Hugo has. I think what we like about Hugo is you can sort of understand why he's single and why he finds it difficult to relate to Alice. Whereas Hubert just seems he's young.
Yeah.
Bit generic.
Yeah, and I think there's something about the relationship that he has with his father that you get very clearly in Vicar of Dibley, because they have scenes together in the family home.
Yeah.
And you see how overbearing David is. But you don't get that kind of relationship here, and so a lot of that sets the scene for Hugo, so you don't get that for Hubert in the same way.
Yeah.
Yeah. Also, Hugo versus Hubert it's just a really interesting choice.
Yeah.
I feel like that's how they changed the name.
Hubert.
But yeah, and Henry Wesley, David Horton equivalent. I feel like he's one of the strongest characters.
Yes.
I think we know who he is right from the start.
Yeah, agreed.
Very different from David Horton, actually.
And he would need to be so, because there's something about sort of the Tory voting, aristocratic, British, sort of English country gentleman, which just does not translate at all. And one of the things I was wrestling with during this episode was, why does he care so much about this church? It makes sense for David Horton to be throwing his power and his money around, but does it make sense for Wesley?
And then it does.
We give him that. Yeah,
and then it does. So I was really surprised and impressed by that. We'll come to that later, though.
He doesn't quite have the acerbic wit that David Horton has.
No, he says things trying to get a laugh, which David would have just said,
and they don't
work because he's trying to get the laugh. And he was the other actor that I vaguely recognised. I didn't vaguely recognise. And then I looked him up, good old IMDb. I was like, it's the bloke from Pirates of the Caribbean. That was the only thing I recognised him from.
It's Gibbs.
It's Gibbs, I was like, he's a lot cleaner.
Okay, right, moving on. So next we have Sally Potter, who's the Alice equivalent. I quite liked her. Again, I feel like they've put work into her character. She's not as completely balmy as Alice is. She's a little bit more connected to reality, I think, than Alice is. And I think we see that in various points through the episode. Even right down to the final joke. She actually gets the joke.
Yeah.
After a bit, which Alice would never get the joke.
No, Alice does get that one.
Oh,
yeah,
she
does.
That one?
She gets that joke about, because it's the blind man joke, and she does eventually get it, and has that manic laughing.
Oh, she howls, doesn't she? That's right.
But they didn't have that relationship build up as much as. But anyway, rest of the cast.
So then we have our Owen equivalent character, who is Buzz Nesbitt.
I liked him.
I didn't really connect with him at all.
No,
sorry.
I liked him because to me it felt like they translated him better as well. So they'd gone for your kind of deep South farmer, a bit of a redneck in his flannel and his cap. So that's why and the jokes sort of works, but
I remember now. I remember some of his jokes and some of the things that he had going on for him about what Jesus looked like.
Yeah.
No, actually, I take that back. Now that I remember that, did work.
Yeah.
And it did point towards the context in which they were based. You know, it felt like a good American Owen in that regard.
Yeah. And again, something which I think could have been, if we saw a full season, would be really interesting to see develop more. Next we have Fred Poole, who is our Frank equivalent and is British.
Oh, is he?
Yeah, he had a British accent, didn't he?
Yeah. He was also the only black actor in this, wasn't there?
Yeah.
And
but that's nice to see some of that diversity.
Yeah.
Which we don't have in Vicar of Dibley.
Yeah. And I think they hinted
Absolutely.
that he was going to be gay as well, slightly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, but not much development beyond that. I think what we see in the first episode of Vicar of Dibley is that really clear, oh, this guy is really, really, the word I want to use isn't appropriate. He's really precise about the minutes.
Yes.
Whereas
for him, it was like a weird quirk that it was like, oh, I just, you know, fall asleep.
I just like reading the minutes.
I thought Frank was quite handsome in this. Oh, except he's not. Oh, no, he is Frank. Or no, Fred.
He's Fred.
He's Fred.
I thought Fred was quite handsome.
Yeah, it's still a dapper fellow.
It was interesting to make him a younger character than, and actually a lot of the characters were a lot younger than the Vicar of Dibley cast.
He didn't have the sort of malicious compliance that Frank has.
Yeah.
Or that sense of being really, really, really boring. He didn't have that clear quirk, and I think that's maybe the difference that we have is less of the core characters have those clear quirks, which we're supposed to recognise them by.
Yeah.
There are some who've been developed that way, and others which are not quite as developed. So anyway, they have all gathered round the table, and they say, "Oh, we are receiving our new minister." Difference to UK version, where they are sending out the need to have one. They're saying that the Reverend Poth has passed away and they needed to recruit a new minister. Here, the minister is coming, and they talk about the Reverend Sidney Hudson and their hope that he will be a young man who will uphold the conservative values of the congregation. And I found it really interesting that they made it really clear from the outset that this is a conservative congregation, which we don't get, again, in the UK version. It's sort of, because it came out when female ministers were new, in a way it didn't necessarily matter what the tradition of the church was. It was always going to be controversial. Whereas here, they've made it really clear this is a conservative church.
And that's their issue when it turns out that Sydney's a lady.
Yeah, so
and what a lady.
Sydney arrives. I know.
She comes in.
Ross, you
blonde hair, magnificent bosom.
Well, yeah, I mean, the first thing to say is that, you know, this is sort of a mashup of two scenes. You've got the scene of the first parish council meeting, but it's also the scene of Sydney arriving. And whilst a lot of that is split up with Vicar of Dibley. So it's kind of a bit of a whirlwind scene, because we're trying to get to know all of these different parish council characters, and then suddenly we're getting to know Sydney Hudson as well, as she arrives, breezing straight in, and actually I think even begins to sit down and start to chair the meeting at some point.
She does.
She pushes him out the way.
Good for her, but it was a strange scene in that regard, I thought, just because it was trying to accomplish so much.
Yeah.
Yes, and really interesting and weird the way they changed her opening line. So Geraldine comes in and says, "Oh dear, you're expecting a bloke, beard, Bible, bad breath." And so instead you got a babe with a bob cut and a magnificent bosom.
Such a good line.
Sydney changes this to, "Oh dear, you were expecting a mousy little chick, glasses, Bible, bad breath. Instead you got a babe with blonde streaks and a magnificent bosom."
Yeah.
I found that really interesting. That the joke suddenly becomes, from her perspective, not that, "Oh, you're expecting a man, but look how great I am."
Yeah.
Instead, I don't know, I felt uncomfortable with that kind of a mousy little chick. I'm a mousy little chick. I'm mousy.
Yeah, and she's not wearing a dog collar either, so it's not as obvious.
No,
she's
not.
wearing a cross, but it's not like we would recognise vicars from dog collars, as we are all sat here wearing them in the same way. So she has a rather low-cut top. It's very fetching on her, but she's not as obviously the vicar as we would understand.
Yeah, have I internalised some misogyny here though? Because in my notes, when I was talking to Ross beforehand as well, I said for me she comes off as a lot more brash than Geraldine.
And I wanted to know, Kate, what you mean by brash, because oh no, I'm gonna mansplain.
I'm gonna mansplain it.
Everyday sexism would say that some women are brash, but maybe they're just
assertive.
confident.
Yeah.
So I wanted to unpack what that meant.
So, dictionary definition of brash is self-assertive in a rude, noisy, or overbearing way. Often used against women whenever they show any type of confidence. What would be described as assertiveness in a male leader might be called brashness in a female leader. I feel like in comparison to Geraldine has a little bit more of self-awareness and a wry humour of she knows that they're not happy to have her. And she's trying to create repartee with people. And although she is confident and a bit bolshy in kind of coming in and being quite, I just feel like Sydney, like the kind of pushing Mr. Wesley out of the way to chair the meeting and maybe not even considering that, not quite reading the room. I don't know. Again, I think it might be internalised misogyny, maybe.
Ruthie, how's your internalised misogyny?
Alive and well. Yes, I think she was too much of a caricature. There wasn't the subtlety that there is in the same way that with Geraldine, that you pick up that Geraldine's a bit of a flirt. It's a bit of a kind of banter thing. Whereas, with Sydney, it's just out and out kind of, there isn't a subtlety to it at all. And, there's a scene much later on where the service is going on and she's, saying, who's here to see the vicar with the dodgy past? And it was, it wasn't as subtle. And I think this was the thing of cramming it all in, that actually their big issue was, they seemed to think she had a bit of a past, a bit of a checkered history, and that was their issue with her. Whether they would have had the same issue if she was a man like that, then that's a very different question. But
I don't think they would have. Yeah, no. I think maybe it's because also we are so tied with affection to Geraldine.
Yeah.
That seeing this different actress playing the role.
You're not our Geraldine.
And actually, in a character who, if we watch her in Cheers or Third Rock from the Sun or Look Who's Talking, they're the things I know her from. Actually, that's kind of true to the sort of characters that she plays, and I don't find them overbearing in any way in those instances.
Yeah.
I think I'm coming from a very different opinion from you two. I really enjoyed Sydney coming in, and I think, context is everything. Geraldine is a character written to get the British public used to the idea of what a woman in a dog collar might look like. I think if we were to look at America in the mid-noughties, this came out in 2007, was that right? I think there is a different kind of theological movement going on in America at that time. And I think in many ways we could perhaps liken Sydney to somebody like Nadia Bolz-Weber.
Yes.
Somebody who is very open about, someone who's very open about the fact that, they've got a checkered past, but they stand for the love of God's grace. That doesn't mean that they're not going to go and hang out with their friends and enjoy a night out with some drinks. And I liked that actually Sydney was a very different character to Geraldine.
Yeah.
And I really appreciated that. Actually, she did come in and she did start to chair the meeting.
Yeah.
And I don't mind that she's got these different assumptions. That, she walks into a room and thinks, let's get to know each other. Let's sit down and talk and get to know one another. And actually, there is something. Sure, the other characters are then taken aback by that, but that's perhaps says more about them than it does about her.
Yeah. And I think it ties with one of the very fundamental differences. As you said, Vicar of Dibley was created to help normalise female clergy and to address the fears that people had about female clergy. In that first episode, it's the fear of having tights drying on the church radiators, right? Yeah. And so Geraldine has to be a character who automatically gets on with people and is addressing those anxieties about having women in leadership. Whereas here, and she goes in knowing that because she was one of the first female clergy. Whereas with Minister of Divine, actually, Sydney has no reason to expect that they're not expecting a female priest. Yeah. She has been sent there. And it's a context where they have, they're assumedly other women have been ordained in the area. She's not going in expecting to be opposed on grounds of gender, and ultimately she isn't. The main conflict of the episode is not about her gender, but is actually about her politics,
her morality,
and her activism, and her morality. Those are the questions. And I think if it was a full series, and if actually they'd gone with that initial description of a woman with a checkered past returns to her hometown, where her past would have been very well known, that would have been a really interesting story of her coming back, and they all know some of the things she's done in her past, and she's trying to now be a minister. So thank you, Ross, for challenging our internalised misogyny there.
You're welcome. That's what men are for.
Oh my goodness, folks, we're still on the first scene. Let's carry on.
This is classic us doing an episode, though, where we talk about the first scene for way too long.
We're going to move on to scene 3, which is... so the scene 2 ends with Sydney talking about the fact that a sign from God that she should be there. She should be their new minister. And then there is a bolt of lightning and a thunder crash, and the power goes out, and there's an enormous crash, and we catch up with them as they are in the church, seeing a tree through the window.
Yeah.
And for those of you who know the Vicar of Dibley may be thinking, wait, that's
the wrong
a whole other episode.
Yeah. That's the window and the weather. She arrives in the storm, and they've used that storm to mash up the episodes. And introduce another plot device. Maybe because Vicar of Dibley follows quite simply the A plot, B plot structure for episodes. Whereas this, it feels like they've added a C plot in, or it feels like they're adding too many plots in to keep track of. But now we have the tree through the window. And Sydney tries to be optimistic.
Yeah, I did like that she set fire to it. I did think that was a good addition.
Yeah, she sets fire to it as well. But, yeah,
that was great.
That was quite funny.
Yeah.
And then we get to the cut to the next scene. It's the next morning, I assume. And Sydney is painting a huge sign.
Over the whole of the window, isn't it?
Over the whole of the window, over the whole of the church, that says "End global warming."
Yeah.
This is fascinating, and I love this because I think actually it really gets into the character of Sydney and actually what are the divides that are going on within an American small town. Actually, a lot of it is going to be political, but even under that, for us vicars, it's something theological. There is, saying end global warming is a theological statement as much as it is a political statement.
Yeah. And it's very much making Sydney's agenda clear. Yeah. In contrast to Mr. Wesley having said we want someone who upholds the conservative values of our church, here is someone straight off the ball saying, right, let's be activists.
Yeah.
And that's, Sally then comes up and says, oh, I'm not sure Mr. Wesley's going to be happy about this. Yeah.
I've suddenly got the Bechdel test in mind because here we've got two women in a scene talking about a man and what a man likes.
Does it pass the Bechdel test?
Does the Vicar of Dibley pass? Yes, the Vicar of Dibley must pass the Bechdel
but
test.
I'm not sure this episode does.
No, because Dorothy's always talking about dating a man and getting engaged.
She is.
Anyway, sorry.
Anyway, they have a conversation about the Wesleys being the powerful members of a congregation, and Sydney kind of does a sly, is Mr. Wesley married?
I didn't see it that way.
Learn.
Yeah,
Really?
I think it's
did.
established later on there's flirting and all this stuff going on, and I think that's something they would have changed in this if they'd done a full season of it. But I
I saw the flirting right from the first scene they had together.
That's your internalised misogyny.
Ooh, that's interesting.
But I did like I liked the difference with this one with Sally. She talks about her dad in this immediately, and she knows who her dad is. He's in prison. But that was a difference that I thought, that's interesting that they can build on that character as well. But,
him saying that he'd kill her if she hung out with any man. And Sydney says, "Oh, dads are always like that," and Sally says, "No, he said this to me when he's in prison." So I liked how Sally talked about Hubert in this, and you could tell I quite like you. But again, this was something rushed, and they crack on with it. Yeah, and it's right in there. Whereas again, in Vicar of Dibley, we know that attraction is there from the start, but it takes a while for them to be brought for Alice and Hugo to be brought together. It's a slow build.
One thing, whilst we're just talking about Sally, is that she's there at the parish council meeting, which is also the welcome for Sydney, and is introduced as the parish verger and
as a vicar's assistant.
As a vicar's assistant, and immediately. Sydney says, "Oh, do you want to continue with the job?"
Yeah.
And you get a cut to Mr. Wesley. But it was never established before that Wesley would have loved to have seen the back of Sally as the vicar's assistant, whilst in Vicar of Dibley you get that dolt, Alice.
There was a little bit, but there wasn't enough to go,
But it's interesting because I think one of the things you get with Alice is that one of the jokes about Alice is that she's this rural girl who's probably so many times inbred. That's part of the joke. That's part of the joke around Alice. And that could easily have been translated over to America with certain stereotypes. But I quite like the little joke about the fact that they're going into the church and it's a really small doorway, and she says, "Oh, I keep bumping my head on it."
That was nice.
And Sydney says, "Oh, well, that explains a few things." And it just felt a lot
that was a good line.
It felt a lot kinder and gentler, I thought.
Yeah, she's less of an extreme character that Alice is. Again, Vicar of Dibley, they go quite extreme with the characters. Whereas this, it feels like they've pulled some of them in a bit more to maybe make them a bit more relatable to a US audience. I don't know. There's less of that eccentricity. There are eccentric characters, but in Vicar of Dibley, every character is an eccentric character. So yeah, I really like Sally. I feel like actually when I was watching this, I was thinking, this could take place in the same universe as the Vicar of Dibley. I could see this being like Dibley's over in the UK and Divine is in the US, and there could be a twinning parish episode. Anyway, I think we get glimpses of what this relationship between Sydney and Sally could be, and it might be, dare I say, it's a healthier relationship than Geraldine and Alice, which is a lovely relationship, but Geraldine does occasionally get quite cruel to Alice, even though her comments go straight over Alice's head, whereas I feel like Sally would pick up more on those comments. Maybe.
Interesting.
So that
Well, we'll move on to the next scene because all of a sudden, we've moved from, Sydney's barely arrived, and I mean, she seems to have done some things, but there's no real sense of how much time has passed. But there's been some kind of a singles night for elderly members of the town, and Dorothy has ended up engaged,
but she doesn't know to who.
But she doesn't know to who, and that's part of her story arc for the pilot episode. But there's the next parish council meeting, and Sydney hasn't arrived yet, but everyone else is there. And Wesley has presented this letter of objection to Sydney.
Addressed to the head of state church council.
So, US listeners, if that gives you any clues as to what denomination we're talking about here,
please
let
us
us know.
In the UK, it would be a letter to the bishop.
Yeah.
I assume
in the Church of England,
it would be the same in the Episcopalian Church.
Well,
I don't know.
Certainly the bishop.
Interesting that Dorothy says something along the lines of, "Is this because she's a woman?"
Yeah. No, but yes.
And no, but yes, and also Mr. Wesley says, "I know it's not PC."
Yeah.
That's interesting. That also is very 2007.
Yeah, I mean, if it was now, it would be woke, wouldn't it?
Yeah. But also,
that
in that period of 2000s, I feel like the idea of political correctness gone mad was also...
That was big.
At least in the UK, that was talked about.
It's also the fact that global warming and not climate change or climate crisis.
And Mr. Wesley says, rather than... So David Horton is friends with the bishop, isn't he? And that's how his connection with the bishop is. Whereas here, Mr. Wesley has reached out to a friend who was in seminary with Sydney.
Yeah.
So that's theological college. And he has found out... Yeah, he's done a background check, and he has found out that she was a party girl and made some bad life choices.
Hey, are either of us party girls who've made bad life choices? I think I am.
I wouldn't describe myself as a party girl. I think we've all made bad life choices.
I remember our nights out at Cranmer Hall, Kate.
Well, I'm just
not as many as you would. Ruthie.
I definitely danced on the tables at the Rainbow Room in Durham. So.
Oh, I don't think we should have our actions at theological college
reflect
against us.
They should not define us, and they should neither define Sydney.
No. Indeed, she has moved on. Maybe one of my criticisms of this episode is we get less of Sydney's sense of faith and a sense of, yes, I've got a past, but, now that I've met Jesus, I've discovered I can still be a party girl and love God, but the way I'm a party girl is different. I just feel like there could have been something there, but we don't get that. Sydney breezes in. She's been late. She's late. She's brought some donuts.
Yeah.
She's licked the chocolate off the donuts. That's less kind, but that feels very Geraldine. And she's wearing a t-shirt. Ruthie, talk about her t-shirt.
Yeah, she walks in wearing a t-shirt that says, "Ministers do it on a Sunday." Which,
it's provocative.
Just very provocative. It asks questions. First of all, if Sundays are busy, people are very tired. So I'm not sure ministers actually do it on a Sunday if we're taking this literally.
If they are doing is sleeping.
Yes, then absolutely they do. It's just, it was again the subtlety thing of, Geraldine breezes in her fantastic jumper that her blind nan
I love Geraldine's
knitted.
jumper.
And this is just an immediately very provocative. I mean, I have a t-shirt that says "Performers do it on stage" from my drama days. So I cannot claim too much superior morality here. I just thought, it's a bit, if there was a Jesus is my homeboy one or something, that would be...
Or if there was more development about her being provocative deliberately to help expose something or challenge something in Mr. Wesley. But it's not really discussed. I think she says she's been visiting and getting to know people, which is really good. Points in her favour. Doing her job. Tick. But there's that awkwardness of them looking at her chest, like her t-shirt, but also don't like her t-shirt. I don't know where I fall on it. I wouldn't wear it to go visiting people I've never met before. Yeah, it just feels like a weird choice on a first introduction to someone. Like I said, it feels like she's making a statement, and if they made more of a point of the statement she's making, like if she really was really leaning into her being a Nadia Bolz-Weber type character, and actually she's deliberately there to provoke and cause question and cause conversation, and if they were leaning into that, I think I would find it a bit easier, whereas it's just kind of there and not really addressed. And I don't know, it just feels like there was something missing for kind of developing why she's wearing that top. Because it's a decision to wear a top that is provocative like that as a minister. And especially as a female minister, because you know it will provoke.
So she arrives and...
She jumps into wanting to discuss the storm damage downstate and making a plan for the stained glass window. And they cost it at $40,000 to replace the window.
Yeah.
You get a little bit of that scene that they have in The Window and the Weather about what did the actual window depict, but it's nowhere near as extensive or nearly half as funny, and it's resolved
immediately.
They resolve
very
it very
scene.
quickly, whereas when Frank checks the minutes in the UK in Window and Weather, they can't make out what the minutes say or something like that.
Well, they don't.
Or there's a contradiction.
They don't find the minutes immediately, so they're talking and they're trying to work out. They're saying, there's a bloke with a beard. Well, could that be Jesus? And I swear there's animals. Well, maybe it's or maybe it's the Sermon on the Mount or Moses and all this stuff.
You can see the reflection in the corner of my dog's eye.
That was Jenny's favourite line, and she cried.
Yeah, it was Jenny's favourite.
Jenny.
Oh, we love you, Jenny.
Yeah, we love Jenny. So they breeze through that, and it's less funny because of that. And then they immediately then go back to, oh yes, the letter you wanted to talk about. And in The Arrival, the Vicar of Dibley episode, this is a really emotional moment. Yeah. Where you can see and you can feel Geraldine's heart breaking. She's come in really optimistic and ready to get to grips with the parish council and start doing good, and they start reading this letter objecting to her. Here they say the objection is her lapses of morality in the past and non-traditional agenda. I don't find it as heartbreaking a moment. And neither does Sydney, but I really like Sydney's response.
She gets up and she says, right, well, I can't stop you from sending that letter, but I'm going to go and start speaking to people about getting this ministry done. And I think that's such, it's, again, context is completely different, but she's like, you can do what you like. I'm here with a mission, and I'm going to get on and do it. And,
I'm on a mission
and there's
from
something
God.
really empowering about that. Yeah. Thank you, Blues Brothers.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention with this scene, there's some of the stuff that Vicar of Dibley gets wrong that appears in this, and because it's an updated version, I wish it didn't. Because the guy who's called Buzz does it keeps talking about the way that Jesus looks, and says that thing about, Jesus wasn't bald and all this kind of stuff. Look, there's a picture of him above there. He was a handsome man. Not saying I'm gay or anything, but, and I just thought, this is some of the stuff. I mean, they do really good things with Frank, his storyline. I'm Frank. Yeah, it's Fred in this. I'm getting confused now, with his storyline when he comes out, but some of the stuff that has aged Vicar of Dibley was present in this, and I was just like, why did you have to say that you're not gay for Jesus? That's a weird thing to say.
I mean, as a gay viewer, I watched it, and again, it's 2007, so different jokes are being made. I do think it also reflects something about the context of Dibley, and actually, of Divine rather, that actually in America there are people who would, who would say, who would absolutely say that. I think there is something truthful to that character, and I think it would have been interesting to see how that may develop over the course of a series, to see how that may be challenged or not. So I wasn't offended by it. It felt true to character,
I must admit, I was more offended by Sydney's response of the Bible doesn't really tell us what Jesus looked like. Well, yes, except it did tell us that he was a Middle Eastern Jewish man, which tells us a lot about what he looked like.
I mean, yeah, it's not explicit, but it does. We are delivered the context of where Jesus is born and his ethnicity, so we kind of get some idea.
And cultural traditions that would assume that he would probably have a beard and a specific type of haircut. But anyway,
the only thing we know about Jesus' body, we can cut this if we want to, is that he was circumcised.
I thought that, but didn't say it.
Everything else is inferred by the culture into which he was born. Indeed.
I didn't want to think about
We've got to move on.
We are going to move now on to the vicarage, where we have the same line from Geraldine.
Slightly changed.
Oh, is it slightly changed?
Yeah, Geraldine says, "Come in if you're sexy and you love Jesus," I believe. Whereas here it's "Enter if you're sexy."
Oh, I
and
think
you
it's
love Jesus.
"Enter."
I think it's...
Come in if you're sexy and love Jesus.
I'm pretty sure, I think it's always quoted as "Enter if you're sexy and love Jesus." But
it's a nice line to carry over either way. The whole "if you're sexy and love Jesus," it's a really fun line from Vicar of Dibley, and it works.
Yeah,
it
the
works
fact
here
that
again. I think
it's Hubert at the door, and he says, "I don't know."
I don't know.
Yes.
Yeah,
actually, that's
that was good.
Yeah,
whereas. Actually, when Geraldine does it, is a bit of a pastoral mistake.
Yeah, because it's David.
Well, she's with
she's with Alice.
Isn't it Owen who comes?
No, it's David.
No, she's with. So Geraldine is with Alice. They're by the door, and she does it as a joke, and they open it, and it's David.
Oh yeah. Right. Whereas here, she's in the vicarage. She's in a pink nightie and a dressing gown. Sally is somewhere.
Yeah.
Hubert comes in, and really the scene is setting the scene of Sydney pushing Hubert and Sally together.
Yes, and one of the things that she's doing, I don't know if you could work this out, because I couldn't, because of the quality of the video that we were watching. I think she's putting up pictures of handsome men on her walls, which is a very wonderfully crossover from Geraldine, but I could not work out who it was at all, who she was putting on the walls. But I did like that little detail as well. But yes, you're right. This is we're pushing Hubert and Sally together quite literally with her bottom at one point, which I did like. I did think that was funny.
Yeah, and putting his hand on her knee.
That was subtle.
While at the same time watching the news and hearing about all the people who've been displaced due to the storm. Weird. So the pushing Alice and Hugo together, that doesn't happen, isn't it, till later of season 1? Or was it start of season 2 of Vicar of Dibley?
There's always been a bit of a flirtation between them, isn't it?
But the actual pushing them together
is much later.
That is an episode in itself, isn't it?
Yeah.
So they have less of the will they, won't they of Hugo and Alice. I mean, they were always going to end up together, but we delighted in their awkwardness and their dithering around each other, which we don't get here. They're kind of pushed together a bit more explicitly.
And it's lovely again to see the heartbreak of Sydney at the moved by the storm and those who have lost their homes to the storm. And of course that's going to be a very real thing in America. Hurricane Katrina, for example. Whilst I think for Geraldine it was an overseas disaster, possibly war relief, maybe.
I do feel like this scene is out of order. I mean, it's in the wrong place in the episode. I think it works really well in the Vicar of Dibley episode in Winter and the Weather because it's after Geraldine has made the success of getting all the money and securing that funding. Yeah. And then she watches the news bulletin and is all these people who actually need aid.
Yeah. I just had a little look up, and Hurricane Katrina had happened in 2005. So actually, it'd been 2 years later, there still would have been the devastation of that, wouldn't there? And been, that would have been a good reference point for culturally.
Yeah, it feels like the emotional beat is in the wrong place of the episode, though, because she hasn't secured the funding yet. She hasn't had this celebration of we've got enough money to put this new window in.
Yeah.
Yeah, it just feels like it would have had a bigger punch if it was after she'd secured the funding.
Yeah.
And we see her conscience being challenged. Well, we don't quite get that here, although we do see her upset.
Yeah.
Scene 7 gives us Mr. Wesley's study, and this is where Sydney and Mr. Wesley have their confrontation, and we learn a bit more about Wesley's situation, especially with regards to his wife.
Yeah,
this is where we
good.
learn that actually his wife died, and she loved the church. She served the church all her life, and that's why Mr. Wesley doesn't want it to ever change, because it is connected to his grief for his wife.
Yeah, and this is, I think, what I liked most about this episode, is they really give him a reason for why he doesn't want there to be change. And it's a real human reason that I think we encounter in everyday ministry. Yeah. I wrote down exactly what he said as well. I love this church. My wife loved this church. And I will do everything in my power to make sure that it doesn't change. And he also talks about how the church has been a great help for him in his grief.
Yeah.
And Sydney challenges him with saying, never change, never grow. That's the worst thing that can happen to a church. Yeah. And he says, not my church. And she says, your church. But then she pauses and she says, oh, this is how it's going to be like, isn't it? And I like that awareness she has of this isn't a battle that she should be fighting, and that there's an emotional charge here. And I really, really liked this scene.
I think it was less, this isn't a battle I should be fighting. I think I've just clocked some of the awkward power dynamics at play here. We're always going to be back and forth. But actually what she does is she takes the heat out of it. Instead of rising to him, she says, this is what it's always going to be like. So she steps back and she creates a space which actually I think leads to the parish council vote. Actually, she carries herself with enough dignity and grace, I think, to allow that space for disagreement and debate. But I think that helps to create the space for the vote in the end.
But I think she could have helped herself better, because he says all this stuff about, my wife loved it and I loved it and this is why I never want it to change. And she doesn't pause and go, I'm so sorry that this happened to your wife and that it's I can see clearly this is a really important thing for you. She immediately launches into, but it can't change, like, not changing is such a bad idea. And I just think pastorally she misses a beat there of going, you've got the reason why he's being so cantankerous, and actually you need to work on that first before you just go, but everything needs to change. And I think, that needed to have, been used a bit better before it kind of, launched straight into it. And this is the point as well in this that I thought they're immediately building up the sexual tension between the two of them. Oh yeah. And it was like there looked like a moment, and I thought, oh gosh, are they going to make them kiss at this point? Please don't make them kiss at this point. Yeah. I wonder if they would change the dynamics of this relationship.
After this sort of emotional moment, and Sydney actually makes an agreement with Mr. Wesley that if Mr. Wesley pays for the window, she will step down.
Yeah, that's weird.
And they sort of have this agreement. And anyway, at that moment, the parish council come in. They say, we never voted about sending this letter. And they vote to hold off on sending the letter until the first service has happened to see if people attend.
So this is a lot that's going on within her very first week.
So much is happening. And so we cut to the church service. It's a final scene of the episode, really. And it's standing room only.
Full church.
It's a full church. She gives a sermon which doesn't hit as strongly as Geraldine's first sermon does. Let's just say that. She does acknowledge, how many of you came to see the lady pastor with the shady past.
All hands go up.
All hands go up.
Eventually.
She then starts a sermon which sounds like it's going to be a rehash of Geraldine's sermon of when I was a little girl. I thought I was going to be a supermodel and marry Elton John. But then she goes into religion can be a very touchy subject these days. Everyday people are doing terrible things in the name of God. What about us doing something to change that? calls the parish council up, reveals the window, which is clear glass, and says that they've given the rest of the money to for the relief of those who've been affected by the storm.
And I do think it's a really nice way of tying the window to, tying it to the church and that community, but also tying in to Wesley. He says, my wife always said that was the best view. And so all of a sudden, actually, there is some kind of celebration there that sort of brings it full circle, which I appreciated.
Yeah.
It feels a bit rushed. And to
For
me,
sure.
as a sermon, I don't know. Again, I would have liked something about God beyond people doing bad things in the name of God. I just feel like there could have been a bit more of that reflection on the conflicts of the episode at that point.
Yeah.
Which we didn't get. And then they all sing I Can See Clearly Now the Rain Is Gone, which made me cringe.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't work without Cecil. With the choir and doing the
Well, that's a whole other episode to cram in into the 20 minutes, though. Well, the final scene is really the same as we have with Geraldine and Alice. A little scene in the vestry where Sydney tells a joke to Sally, and it's exactly the same as it plays out in Vicar of Dibley. It's the blind nun in the bath joke. No, she's not blind. It's a blind man. Nun in the bath.
Nun in the bath. Blind man comes to the door, says he's the blind man, meaning he's the man come to install blinds rather than the visually impaired man.
Yeah.
And
it's the same, and it's a lovely gag.
It's a great joke.
And it works.
It
works. It's a good joke.
So that was the whole episode.
Yeah, that's the Minister of Divine. A weird mashup of various different elements of a Vicar of Dibley, some of which worked, some of them didn't. Some things we liked, some things we thought needed to be expanded more.
Yeah.
Would you have liked to have seen a full series?
I'm going to say yes, because I think sometimes things like the US version of Ghosts starts off a little bit weak, but became quite good as they became more sure of what their setting was and how they differed from the UK version of Ghosts. I haven't watched the US Office, but I understand it's followed that same pattern. I think there could have been potential, but a lot of work would have had to been done to it to make it to really make it good.
I agree. Yeah. I mean, my confessional is that I prefer the American Office to the UK Office. So, I think seeing a whole series would have been interesting. And what storylines would they have kept, and which ones would they have added in that would have been completely different? And, if they're going on a climate change and global warming stance with lots of it, actually the one with the flood, and that would have been the Vicar of Dibley episode with the flood and it's hot weather and they're thinking about flooding the village. That would have been an interesting one to play into for a US context. Yeah, I would have been curious. Absolutely. What about you, Russ?
I think the episode was enough for me. It might have been interesting, but actually, you've got the Vicar of Dibley.
Yeah.
And I think it could have been interesting to see how, in some ways it feels like you've got a great character in Sydney and Wesley, but actually it's a different show. I think if you're really delving into that. So I think they needed to release themselves more from the Vicar of Dibley. I think they needed less of the source material.
Which is what I think when we've seen US adaptations of UK shows work, there has been at some point fairly soon in the first season where they've stepped away from the source material and had their own plot lines, been a bit more connected to this new context.
Yeah.
So, Ross, how can we respond to this episode?
Well, this has been our 50th episode, and it's been really fun being a part, with you guys, talking scene by scene, doing what you did way back when, 2 years ago.
2 years ago.
Oh my goodness.
So, yes.
When we were fresh and young.
Yeah.
We would love to hear from you, dear listeners. what has been a favourite moment for you of these past 50 episodes?
Oh, yeah. Good question.
What has made you think? What has made you laugh? Let us know. We'd love to hear from you. And maybe what you would like to hear about in the next 50 episodes. Let us know. But here is to the next 50 episodes of Vicars Watch Dibley. Pretend we've got glasses, guys. Cheers! Yay.
We hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Vicars Watch Dibley. Thank you to Nat for editing our ramblings.
Any opinions expressed are our own and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Church of England or any other organisation with which we are affiliated.
If you like our podcast, leave us a review, follow us on social media and share it with your friends. And, as always, bless you for listening.
So I figured, as it's our 50th, and we should go back to an original Dibley-esque kind of joke. So it's a joke about nuns. You ready?
Yay! Here we go.
What do you call a sleepwalking nun?
Oh, I don't know. What do you call a sleepwalking nun?
A Roman Catholic.
Yeah.
A Roman. It doesn't quite work because you get Anglican nuns and
I know. It's
okay,
great.
that didn't work as a joke. Never mind.